The call to prayer echoes over the domes of Istanbul. Marble courtyards gleam beneath the sun, and silk curtains ripple in the breeze of the imperial palace. To the outside world, the Ottoman Empire was a jewel of civilization, grand mosques, powerful sultans, and a legacy of culture that still shapes history. But behind the walls of palaces and the shadowed alleys of provincial towns, another story unfolded, one rarely told, and often deliberately forgotten. In this hidden world, women accused of disobedience, desire, or defiance were not just punished. They were humiliated, their bodies turned into canvases of suffering. From concubines suffocated in the harem to wives paraded half-naked through markets, punishment was never only about pain. It was about control, about silencing a voice, about reminding every woman that her body belonged to the empire before it belonged to herself. This wasn't justice, it was theatre. A theatre of fear where humiliation carried more weight than blood. And though centuries have passed, the memory of these forgotten tortures forces us to ask, why were women's bodies so feared, so targeted, so silenced? To answer, we must peel back the veil of history, entering the empire's darkest chambers. The Ottoman Empire was not only a political giant but also a cultural machine, shaping how millions lived, loved, and suffered for centuries. Beneath its splendor was a world built on hierarchy, religious, social, and gendered. At its core was the conviction that women were never autonomous individuals. They were daughters, wives, concubines, or slaves, always someone's possession, never their own. This belief, cemented by law and reinforced by custom, became the foundation for countless forgotten tortures. Religion was central to Ottoman life, guiding morality and governance. But under the empire's interpretation, women's sexuality was constantly framed as dangerous. Laws derived from Islamic jurisprudence gave men authority over female relatives, and women's honor was tied directly to male reputation. A woman who stepped outside expected roles was not just a personal transgressor. She endangered the spiritual and social fabric of her community. Desire itself became suspect. A woman accused of immodesty, whether for clothing, glances, or words, could be humiliated publicly. Here, punishment became ritualized theater, reinforcing the idea that one woman's humiliation safeguarded the morality of many. The imperial harem symbolized luxury in European imagination, silks, jewels, women competing for a sultan's favor. But inside its gilded walls, it was a fortress of control. Concubines were prized, yet they lived under constant surveillance by eunuchs and senior women. Desire was not theirs to own. It was rationed, traded, and punished if misdirected. Behind the curtains, disobedience was crushed. Women suspected of infidelity could be suffocated with silken cords, starved in hidden chambers, or exiled from the palace altogether. These punishments were not only physical but deeply humiliating, ensuring that desire itself was feared more than death. Across the empire, women were treated as extensions of male authority. A father decided her marriage, a husband decided her fate. In courts, women's voices were often disregarded unless supported by male testimony. Even wealthy women with influence were still subject to the humiliation of suspicion, their reputations fragile and easily weaponized. For enslaved women, the conditions were harsher still. Female slaves were commodities in markets, stripped and examined like livestock. Their sexuality was not only controlled but monetized, transforming desire into an economy of humiliation. The empire's laws codified the hierarchy. Adultery for women was among the gravest offenses. Accusations, sometimes based only on rumor, could bring brutal punishments, floggings, stoning, or public parades. Men's offenses, by contrast, were often overlooked or excused, deepening the double standard. Even minor disobedience, like speaking against a husband or resisting domestic expectations, could be framed as rebellion. For women, Every act of independence carried the shadow of punishment. Beyond palaces and courts, ordinary neighborhoods became extensions of surveillance. Women were expected to embody modesty in dress and behavior. Markets, baths, and streets buzzed with whispers. A woman walking alone risked suspicion. A woman laughing too loudly invited judgment. This constant scrutiny was itself a form of humiliation, an invisible cage reinforced by gossip and fear. This hierarchy was not theoretical, it was lived daily. And nowhere was it more stark than in the empire's own palaces. Behind golden gates, under painted ceilings, the women of the harem endured punishments that revealed the empire's darkest obsession, the control of female desire, cloaked in silk but sharpened by iron. The imperial harem was a paradox: lavish chambers filled with silk and gold, yet beneath the surface it was a cage of fear. For outsiders, it was a world of beauty and seduction. For the women inside, it was a theater of control where even whispers of disobedience could bring humiliation, pain, or death. The punishments devised within these palace walls reveal the empire's deepest anxieties about female power and desire. On the surface, the harem promised privilege. Women wore the finest fabrics, dined on delicacies, and lived in rooms more ornate than the homes of nobles. But luxury was no shield. These treasures were bait in a gilded prison, ensuring women remained compliant. Every silk curtain concealed the threat of suffocation, every jeweled ornament a reminder of their fragile position. The women of the harem were never free. They belonged to the sultan, and their lives were measured by his desires. Rivalries were inevitable, but so was punishment. To step out of line was to risk becoming a cautionary tale for others. One of the most infamous punishments was strangulation by silken cord. The choice of material was deliberate. Silk left no marks, preserving the illusion of honor even in death. For concubines accused of betrayal or disobedience, suffocation was swift yet humiliating, reducing them to silent bodies hidden from history. This punishment was not merely execution, it was symbolic erasure, a way of saying that women could be adorned in silk one day and destroyed by it the next. Beauty itself became the weapon. Not all punishments ended in immediate death. Some women were confined to secret chambers within the palace. These were not comfortable rooms, but dungeons of silence. Food was rationed, water withheld, light restricted. Days turned into weeks as women slowly wasted away, forgotten by all but their guards. Isolation was perhaps the cruelest form of torture. It stripped women of their community, their identity, their voice. Within the bustling palace, a woman could vanish without a trace, her silence echoing louder than her presence ever had. The palace was staffed by eunuchs, men whose very bodies were transformed into instruments of control. They enforced discipline, carried out punishments, and ensured no woman acted without surveillance. Their presence was constant, a reminder that desire was never private. For women, humiliation came not only from punishment itself, but from the fact that every movement, every word, every look was monitored. A misplaced glance could spark accusations. A whispered word could summon iron chains. Sometimes punishment was staged as spectacle for others within the harem. A disobedient woman might be forced to bow publicly to serve rivals or to endure verbal lashings before her peers. These acts broke spirit more than flesh, using shame to ensure conformity. Humiliation was the empire's sharpest tool. Death ended defiance, but shame ensured obedience among the living. By humiliating one woman, the palace controlled them all. Not all punishments stayed within palace walls. Some women were expelled, stripped of titles, jewels, and dignity. Cast into obscurity, they returned to lives of poverty, their fall from grace serving as a warning. For many, exile was worse than death. They had tasted luxury only to be banished to hunger and humiliation. These expulsions were public enough to send ripples through society. Stories spread quickly. The woman who defied the sultan, the concubine who lost favor. Each tale became a whispered lesson that desire, ambition, or independence would be crushed. Inside the palace, punishments were hidden, wrapped in silk and silence. But beyond the palace gates, women faced the full glare of public humiliation. In marketplaces and town squares, the empire turned punishment into performance, ensuring that fear extended far beyond palace walls. If the palace walls hid punishments in silk and secrecy, the streets of the empire broadcast humiliation like theatre. Public punishments were designed to strip women not only of dignity but of identity, ensuring their suffering became a lesson for all who watched. Pain was part of it, but shame was the true weapon. To live through punishment meant to live branded by humiliation, unable to escape the whispers of a community that had witnessed your downfall. Ottoman marketplaces were bustling hubs of life traders shouting, spices perfuming the air, coins clinking. But they were also stages of shame. Women accused of immorality, adultery, or disobedience were flogged in public squares. The crack of the whip echoed between stone walls, drawing crowds that treated punishment as spectacle. Humiliation intensified the violence. Clothes were stripped, sometimes fully, sometimes torn just enough to expose. The body, once private, became a canvas of shame for neighbors, strangers, and family alike. Even if the wounds healed, the humiliation left scars that no medicine could mend. One of the most notorious forms of public humiliation was the forced parade. Women accused of sexual transgressions or defiance could be marched through streets with shaved heads, stripped garments, or ropes around their necks. Signs declaring their crime hung from their bodies, transforming them into walking warnings. For many, this punishment was worse than execution. Death ended shame. A parade preserved it, ensuring the community itself became the jailer. Women who survived often never reintegrated, forced to live as outcasts, forever carrying the memory of jeers and laughter. In some cases, punishment left permanent marks. Branding irons seared accusations into women's skin. A burned hand or scarred cheek announced guilt long after the punishment ended. Mutilation, cutting hair, slicing ears, or even disfiguring faces was another tactic, destroying beauty that had once been seen as threatening. These practices made humiliation permanent. A woman no longer needed to be paraded through the streets. Her scars spoke for her. Society ensured she remained marked, controlled, and humiliated for life. The reasons for these punishments were often chillingly vague. Disobedience could mean refusing a husband's demand, arguing in public, or being suspected of infidelity without proof. The accusation alone carried weight. A woman's word rarely stood against a man's, and humiliation was easier to enforce than justice. In many cases, the punishment was not about guilt, but about power. The act of humiliating a woman reinforced male dominance in the eyes of the community, proving that order remained intact. Public punishments turned entire communities into accomplices. Crowds jeered, laughed, and gossiped, reinforcing the message that a woman's suffering was entertainment as well as discipline. Neighbors remembered, children repeated stories, reputations collapsed. The collective gaze was part of the punishment. It ensured women felt imprisoned not just by laws but by society itself. Humiliation did not require chains, it required witnesses. Men faced punishments for crimes, but rarely humiliation for desire. A man caught in adultery might pay a fine or endure a brief flogging, but he was unlikely to be paraded half-naked through the streets. Women, by contrast, carried the burden of honor for families and communities. Their humiliation served as symbolic restoration of order, as if one woman's suffering could cleanse the sins of many. This double standard reinforced the idea that female desire was inherently dangerous, requiring harsher, more humiliating controls than men ever faced. Public punishments were not random acts of cruelty, they were sanctioned, often ordered, by religious courts. To understand how humiliation became sacred theatre, we must step into the courtrooms where morality was judged and where desire itself was tried like a crime. The Ottoman Empire was not merely governed by sultans and viziers, it was also ruled by the power of religious law. Sharia courts and religious scholars shaped the everyday lives of women, especially when it came to desire. These courts turned morality into policy, embedding humiliation into legal practice. For women, faith and law were often indistinguishable, and both could become weapons of control. The empire's Sharia courts were not neutral halls of justice. They were arenas where a woman's body and reputation were constantly on trial. Judges, almost always men, presided over cases of adultery, immodesty, or alleged indecency. Witnesses might be neighbors with grudges or husbands seeking vengeance. Proof was often secondary. The appearance of guilt was enough. Punishments were designed not just to correct, but to shame. A man might be fined for sexual misconduct. A woman could be flogged in public or paraded through the streets. In these courts, gender itself determined the verdict. Among the most severe accusations was adultery. A woman accused even without hard evidence faced humiliating trials. Some were forced to undergo virginity tests, crude and invasive examinations, meant to prove purity. Others were interrogated publicly, their private lives dissected before crowds. For those found guilty, punishments ranged from stoning to exile. But often the most devastating punishment was humiliation itself. To be branded an adulteress was to be destroyed socially, condemned to whispers and suspicion long after the punishment ended. Virginity was a fixation of religious morality. In some cases, young women accused of impropriety were subjected to invasive virginity tests ordered by local judges. These so-called examinations were not medical, but ritualized humiliations designed to reinforce male authority over female bodies. Even rumors could force women into these ordeals, stripping them of dignity in front of family and community. The message was clear: a woman's worth was bound to her chastity, and humiliation was the price of suspicion. The policing of desire extended beyond courts into mosques and sermons. Religious leaders preached constantly about female modesty and obedience. Women were told that their voices tempted men, that their clothing invited sin, that their very presence was dangerous unless carefully controlled. These sermons functioned as psychological punishments, instilling shame before any accusation was ever made. Humiliation became internalized. Women were taught to monitor themselves, fearing punishment before it even arrived. Religious scholars issued fatwas, legal rulings that reinforced the policing of desire. Some fatwas demanded harsher punishments for women caught in adultery, while others restricted women's ability to speak in court, to inherit property, or to appear in public without guardians. The impact was clear. Women were silenced. Even when wronged, they risked humiliation by seeking justice. Many chose silence over trial, internalizing shame rather than exposing themselves to public ridicule. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of religious law was how it cloaked humiliation in holiness. Punishments were justified as purification. Public floggings were framed as cleansing the community of sin. Virginity tests were defended as protecting family honor. Even executions were described as moral necessities, sanctified by divine will. This sacred disguise made humiliation harder to resist. To challenge it was not only to challenge law, but to challenge God. For women, that meant humiliation was inescapable, sanctioned both by men and by heaven. But the story of humiliation did not stop in the capital or in courtrooms. Across the vast empire, in provinces stretching from the Balkans to North Africa, local variations of torture and humiliation emerged. To understand the full scope, we must leave Istanbul and walk through the provinces where forgotten cruelties multiplied in new and brutal forms. The Ottoman Empire stretched across continents, spanning the Balkans, the Middle East, North Africa, and Anatolia. Its reach was vast, and with it came a patchwork of cultures, traditions, and local practices. While Istanbul dictated the laws, the provinces often enforced them in their own brutal ways. Tortures and humiliations against women reflected this diversity. Some mirrored palace practices, others invented cruelties shaped by local fears and customs. Together, they reveal how misogyny traveled through the empire, adapting to geography but never loosening its grip. In cities like Istanbul, Damascus, and Cairo, punishments carried an air of formality. Trials in Sharia courts led to public floggings or humiliating parades. But in rural villages far from imperial oversight, punishment was often rawer, harsher, and deeply personal. A woman accused of adultery in a village might be stoned by neighbors without trial. Another might be locked in her family's home for months, starved, or forced into labor as penance. Urban centers used humiliation as theater, while rural communities turned it into survival ritual. In both cases, women bore the weight of communal honor, their suffering a spectacle for others. In the empire's Balkan territories, community honor was fiercely guarded. Women suspected of disobedience could be subjected to public head shaving, a punishment that symbolized loss of beauty and identity. Shaved heads marked women permanently, ensuring that even after the punishment ended, their humiliation continued with every glance. Some records speak of women paraded through villages on donkeys, backwards, with faces painted black, symbols of disgrace. These rituals echoed through folk memory, cementing humiliation as the ultimate deterrent. In Ottoman-controlled regions of North Africa, female slaves endured some of the harshest conditions. Women were sold in bustling markets, stripped bare for inspection. Their humiliation was economic as well as physical, reducing human beings to objects of trade. Punishments for defiance were brutal. Whippings in front of potential buyers, branding with hot irons, or forced parades to mark them as disobedient. Here, humiliation was woven into the very fabric of slavery, stripping women of identity and humanity alike. In provinces like Syria and Iraq, religious authorities often enforced stricter interpretations of morality. Women accused of dishonor could face stoning, their deaths framed as purification for the community. Others endured ritualized flogging outside mosques, their humiliation amplified by the sacred setting. In some towns, women accused of witchcraft or sexual deviance were forced to wear heavy chains in public for days. These punishments blurred the line between superstition and law, making humiliation a tool of both faith and fear. In the Anatolian heartlands, punishments were often enforced within households. Husbands or fathers, emboldened by law, imposed humiliations directly, locking women in storage rooms, forcing them to eat scraps, or binding them in iron restraints. Though less public, these punishments carried their own cruelty. The humiliation was private but relentless, reminding women daily of their subjugation. Stories whispered across generations reveal how these domestic tortures shaped the culture of silence that survived long after the empire's fall. For enslaved women, humiliation was universal. In every corner of the empire, their bodies were commodities. Punishments for resistance, whether fleeing, refusing sex, or defying owners, were always humiliating. Some were forced to wear collars or bells paraded as warnings. Others were branded with symbols of ownership, scars that marked them for life. These practices reveal the empire's darkest truth, that humiliation was not confined to courts or palaces. It was everywhere, embedded in daily life, ensuring women's submission across cultures and classes. Across the empire, humiliation was the common thread, whether in Balkan parades, North African slave markets, or Anatolian homes. The message was the same: women's desire and defiance would be crushed. Yet today these stories are rarely told. To understand why, we must explore the legacy of silence that buried these tortures in forgotten corners of history. The story of the Ottoman Empire is often told in shimmering images: the grandeur of Topkapi Palace, the elegance of Ottoman calligraphy, the triumphs of military conquest. Rarely do the official narratives linger on the dark underside, the forgotten tortures of women that sustained the empire's hierarchy. These stories are not absent because they were unimportant. They are absent because they are inconvenient, exposing the cruelty that ran parallel to beauty, the humiliation that shadowed grandeur. The silence is itself part of the legacy. Empires prefer to remember their glories. The Ottoman legacy has been preserved in mosques, poems, and textiles, but not in the testimonies of humiliated women. Their suffering was seen as necessary, even righteous. Recording it would have undermined the narrative of divine order and imperial justice. And so, silence became policy. The absence of records was not neglect, it was erasure. Even when artifacts of torture survive iron collars, branding irons, or chains, they are often displayed as curiosities, stripped of context. Museums may note them briefly, tucked in corners, described in neutral language. Visitors see objects, but not the women who suffered inside them. The pain becomes abstract, the humiliation reduced to metal under glass. This sanitization continues the legacy of silence. By separating the devices from the lives they destroyed, history avoids reckoning with the truth. The legacy of Ottoman humiliations does not vanish with the empire's fall. It echoes in laws that continue to police women's bodies, in cultures that equate female honor with male pride, and in the persistence of gendered violence disguised as morality. Public shaming, virginity tests, and restrictions on female autonomy remain in some societies, ghosts of an empire still alive in practice, if not in name. For many women, the humiliation of the past is not history, it is lived reality. The Ottoman system revealed a truth that still resonates. Shame is a more enduring weapon than pain. Pain ends with healing or death. Shame lingers, transforming identity and silencing voices. Women punished centuries ago carried that shame to their graves. Communities carried the memory forward, warning daughters to remain silent, obedient, invisible. The legacy of humiliation is intergenerational. Its power lies not just in what women endured, but in how their silence was inherited. To speak these stories aloud is itself an act of defiance. Every retelling challenges the erasure, restoring voices to those who were silenced. By acknowledging forgotten tortures, we reveal the structures that still linger in modern society, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about gender, power, and history. Breaking silence is not only about justice for the past, it is about freedom in the present. If humiliation was designed to suppress women's desire and independence, then remembering it is a way of reclaiming both. The Ottoman Empire, like all empires, was built on contrasts: glory and cruelty, beauty and brutality, faith and fear. Its forgotten tortures remind us that history is not only the story of palaces and sultans, but also of women who suffered in silence. Their humiliation was not random, it was systematic, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. Yet even in silence, there is resilience. Women survived, resisted, endured. Their stories, though buried, resurface when we ask the right questions, when we choose to look at history not only through the eyes of power, but through the eyes of those it crushed. The legacy of humiliation warns us of the dangers of forgetting, because when cruelty is erased, it is more easily repeated. And when shame is left unspoken, it continues its work, binding the living as tightly as it bound the dead.